Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Part 72: How to Translate Reality. Remember the language we are learning. There is one field, phi, the holophase, one continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once: time as omega, space as k, and motion as v, built from both. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and the motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we listen to just one of those echoes and learn how to translate it. In the last part, we crossed an important threshold. We learned how to read. We moved from just knowing that reality is written in the language of phi to actually reading that language in the world around us. We learned to look at a campfire, or a neuron, or a traffic jam, and ask 5 simple questions about rhythms, shapes, flows, structures, and balances. That was the birth of holophase literacy. Today we take the next step. Reading is understanding what the universe is saying. Translation is being able to move between two languages without losing the meaning. Our goal now is to learn how to translate between the everyday way we describe reality and the precise language of phi and its derivatives, so that you can use this language in real thinking, real modeling, and real life. To help you feel what this means, imagine that you speak 2 languages fluently. One language is the language of daily life. This is the language of waves, storms, crowds, economies, memories, hopes, and fears. The other language is the holophase language, the language of phi fields, gradients, curvatures, velocities, and constraint chains. Translation means being able to take an idea expressed in one language and find its faithful, structural equivalent in the other. If someone says, the storm is getting worse, you can translate that into a statement about derivatives and balances in the atmospheric phi field. If the equations tell you a field is near a critical instability, you can translate that back into an everyday picture, like this system is on the verge of a phase change. This back and forth movement is what will make the holophase language a living tool, not just a beautiful theory. A helpful way to picture this is as a table with 2 columns. On the left, you have everyday language, with phrases like a vibrating string, a spinning galaxy, a thought, a market boom, a social revolution, or a forest fire. On the right, you have holophase language, with descriptions like phi equals displacement, fixed boundary conditions, discrete omega k pairs, or phi equals gravitational potential and density, rotational velocity field balanced by gradients. The art of translation is learning how to move across this table. When you hear something in the left column, you ask yourself, what is the phi field behind this? What are its dominant time, space, and motion echoes? What constraints tie those derivatives together? And what balances keep the pattern in place or push it toward change? When you start from the right column, from a structure written in derivatives, you ask, what does this feel like in daily life? What familiar phenomena share this structure? And how can I visualize or explain it to another human being? For translation to be honest and deep, 3 principles must be respected. The first is completeness. The translation is incomplete if it focuses on only one of the 3 echoes. If you translate hurricane only as a shape in space, with swirling clouds, but ignore its lifetime, its changing intensity, and its track across the ocean, then you have missed its temporal and kinematic essence. A complete holophase translation must always honor the triunity, time, space, and motion together. The second principle is precision. You do not have to be perfect, But you do have to be clear about which phi field you are talking about and which derivatives matter most. Translating vibrating string into something that wiggles is too vague. Translating it into a displacement field obeying a wave equation with fixed endpoints is precise. The third principle is fruitfulness. A good translation should reveal something new. It should show you a hidden similarity to some other system, suggest a testable prediction, or open a new question that would not have appeared without the translation. Let us walk slowly through some concrete examples and practice translating from everyday speech into Holophase structure. First, picture a guitar string. In everyday language, you might say, the string is plucked and it vibrates, producing a musical note. In Holophase language, you start by naming the phi field. Here, phi can be taken as the sideways displacement of the string away from its rest position. Time echoes appear as omega, the oscillation frequency of each mode of vibration. The fundamental note has one big hump that goes up and down. Higher harmonics have more humps. Space echoes show up as the pattern along the length of the string, where fixed ends are always at zero displacement, creating nodes, and certain positions in between move the most, creating antinodes. Motion echoes appear when you think about what happens right after the pluck. A pulse travels along the string to each end, reflects, and travels back. Waves move with a definite speed v, which depends on the string's tension and mass per unit length. All of this is governed by a simple constraint chain, the wave equation, which links the second time derivative of phi, the acceleration, to the second space derivative, the curvature. The balance of kinetic and potential energy in the system, tallying how fast the string moves and how bent it is, fixes the allowed patterns. The everyday idea vibrating string has now been translated into a full triune holophase sentence. Now picture a spiral galaxy, slowly turning in deep space. To the naked eye, it looks like a glowing pinwheel. In our daily language, we say, it is a disk of stars rotating around the center. In holophase language, you again begin by asking, what is the phi field here? One natural choice is the gravitational potential, the field that tells matter how to move. Another is the density of stars and gas. The time echoes are the orbital periods of the stars and the pattern speed of the spiral arms, extremely slow omegas measured in millions of years. The space echoes are the gradients of density from bright core to dim outskirts, the curvature of the gravitational potential, and the beautiful spiral patterns that can be understood as particular K modes, standing or slowly rotating density waves in the disk. The motion echo is the rotational velocity field V, which tells you that stars closer to the center orbit faster in angle and that the gas streams along the arms. The constraint chains are the gravitational field equations combined with the equations of motion. They link curvature in the potential to accelerations in the motions. The key balance is between gravitational attraction pulling inward and centrifugal tendency pushing outward. When you translate spinning galaxy into holophase, you see it as a huge, thin, rotating phi configuration whose stability and structure follow from a handful of derivative relationships. For a third example, consider something that feels more intimate and mysterious: a thought. In everyday language, you might say, a thought arose in my mind, or I held an idea clearly for a moment. Translating this into holophase language is more delicate, because our scientific understanding of mind is incomplete, but we can still make a structural translation. We can propose that phi, in this context, is a coarse-grained field of neural activation, or information state across the brain. Time echoes are the changing patterns of firing, pulses of activity in different regions, the rise and decay of a particular pattern that corresponds to the thought. Space echoes are the shapes of activation across the cortical sheet and deeper structures, peaks where neurons are highly active, valleys where they are quiet, and gradients between them. Motion echoes are the flows of activity, how a sensory signal moves through networks, how one idea triggers another, how a narrative of reasoning unfolds as waves of phi travel through loops of connectivity. Topology plays a huge role here, because the brain's network of synapses defines which patterns are even possible. Certain patterns may be attractors, stable states in which the phi field tends to settle. A thought, translated into holophase structure, is a transient visit to such an attractor, a brief, coherent pattern in a very high-dimensional phi field, shaped by decades of learning. As you practice those translations, you will start to see a great benefit. Phenomena that seemed completely unrelated begin to look structurally similar. A vibrating string and a quantum particle in a box become two examples of standing waves in a confined space, both described by discrete sets of allowed modes fixed by boundary conditions. A hurricane and a galaxy reveal themselves as rotating fluid-like systems held together by balances between inward-acting forces and outward motion. A forest fire and a chemical reaction front both become traveling waves in a reactive medium, where the speed of propagation depends on a balance between production and diffusion or transport. Translation does not erase the differences between these things, but it reveals the common grammar that they share. We can also translate more human-scale phenomena. Think of a political revolution. In daily speech, we talk about rising anger, spreading protest, a tipping point, a collapse of the old regime. In holophase terms, we might take phi to be an abstract field representing social tension or legitimacy. Time echoes include how fast protests grow, how quickly strikes spread, how sudden the final collapse is. Space echoes include where the movement is strongest, which regions are calm, where the sharp gradients between opposed groups lie. Motion echoes are the flows of information and people, the movement of crowds, the cascades of defections from the old order to the new. The topology shows up in the network of organizations, communication channels, and key nodes of power. The constraint chains are whatever sociological and economic dynamics couple these pieces. When translated, a revolution looks structurally similar to a phase transition in physics, a shift from one stable attractor to another, when a slow control variable crosses a critical threshold. Or consider an economic boom. Everyday language describes optimism, rising markets, construction, hiring, and rising consumption. In holophase language, phi might represent some composite economic activity or confidence field. Omega is the growth rate of that activity, which might accelerate for a time as positive feedback loops take hold. Spatial structure appears in which regions or sectors grow fastest and where inequalities sharpen. Motion appears in the flows of capital, goods, and people. Topology lies in the financial network, the connectivity between banks, firms, and households. The constraint chain is the set of rules, explicit and implicit, that govern lending, spending, saving, and investment. In this translation, a boom looks like an autocatalytic reaction where the derivative of phi is increased by phi itself, leading to exponential growth until some limiting factor or negative feedback cuts in. When you use the holophase language as a translation tool in this way, you gain a new style of thinking. You train yourself to always ask, what is the phi behind this description? What are its dominant timescales? What are its main gradients? How does it move? What structures stand out? And what forces are in balance? If you find yourself naturally describing a phenomenon in terms of its rhythms, its shapes, its flows, its connections, and its balances, you are already translating. You are taking the raw material of experience and mapping it into the structured space of the master tree. Translation can be tested and refined. A good translation should not just sound poetic. It should help you say and do concrete things. When you translate a storm into pressure gradients, velocity fields, and moisture distributions, that translation should support weather predictions and risk assessments. When you translate an ecosystem into a web of flows and balances, that translation should help you see which species are keystone and which feedback loops stabilize or destabilize the whole. If a translation consistently leads you to wrong expectations or leaves out essential features that other frameworks capture easily, then you have to adjust it. The Holophase program does not ask you to believe every translation blindly. It invites you to treat translation as a craft that improves with feedback from reality. There is also a deep philosophical payoff. Translation reminds you that you are not multiplying substances. You are not saying there is a physical world written in derivatives and a totally separate human world written in stories. You are saying that the stories themselves, the storms and galaxies and revolutions and thoughts, are all expressions of one field, speaking in many dialects. Phi is the single author. The holophase language is the structural grammar. Everyday language is the local poetry. To translate is to recognize the same underlying voice, singing through many melodies. As we reach the end of this part, I invite you to imagine your own mind as a bilingual space. On one side lives your mother tongue, with its emotions, intuitions, metaphors, and memories. On the other side lives the holophase language, with its precise attention to change, structure, and balance. Full literacy means you do not abandon one for the other. Instead, you allow them to talk. When you see a sunset, one voice in you simply says, "Beautiful." The other voice quietly notes the changing angle of the sun, the scattering of light by particles in the air, the gentle gradients of color and brightness. When you feel anxious, one voice names the feeling. The other may notice changes in heart rate, breathing rhythm, muscle tension, and patterns of thought. Both views are true. Together, they make you more whole. To make this concrete, imagine carrying a small mental notebook labeled "Everyday" on the left page and "Holophase" on the right. As you go through your day, you can occasionally pause and jot down a simple observation. On the left, you might write, "Traffic is heavy on the bridge this morning." On the right, you can sketch its translation: a high-density phi field of vehicles, a steep spatial gradient near the bottleneck, a backward-moving wave of slowing and stopping, a network topology defined by lanes and junctions, and a balance between inflow and outflow that is temporarily broken. Later, you might write, "My friend seemed distant today." The translation might note the slowed rhythm of response, lower amplitude in facial expression and tone, different flow of eye contact, and a shift in the topology of connection between you. Even if the translation is rough, the act of trying to map the experience into rhythms, shapes, flows, and balances trains your mind to think structurally. Over time, this practice builds an intuitive library of translations. You begin to see patterns that repeat across domains. You notice that stop-and-go waves in traffic look like cues in computer networks. You see that the spread of laughter in a room follows similar shapes as the spread of a rumor online. You realize that the way stress accumulates in your body through the day has a similar derivative structure to the way heat builds in a machine that is overused. This is not just poetic, it gives you leverage. If you understand one case well, you can borrow its holophase description and use it as a template for another. In this way, translation becomes a bridge for importing insight from physics into biology, from engineering into psychology, from ecology into economics, and vice versa. It is also important to talk about common mistakes in translation so that you can avoid them. One mistake is reductionism, the temptation to say that a rich phenomenon is nothing but its holophase description. You might be excited by the idea that a thought can be translated into patterns of neural activation and start saying that a thought is only a pattern. But that would erase the lived meaning of the thought, the first-person quality that matters most in human life. The correct attitude is to say that the thought has a holophase structure, and that understanding that structure may help us see how thoughts are generated, stabilized, and transformed. The structure does not replace the meaning. It supports it from underneath. A second mistake is laziness, stopping the translation too early. It is easy to translate a phenomenon using only time language, saying that something is just fast or slow, or only space language, saying that something is just big or small, or only motion language, saying that something is just moving or still. The holophase discipline asks a little more. It asks you to always check all three echoes. When you notice you are talking only about how quickly a stock market is rising, it nudges you to also ask how uneven that rise is across sectors and how capital is flowing between regions. When you notice you are only looking at the shape of a coastline from above, it nudges you to ask how it is changing over centuries and how waves, currents, and tectonic motion write that shape. Complete translation is a form of respect for the phenomenon you are studying. A third mistake is overcomplication, using the Holophase language to make things more obscure than they need to be. The purpose of translation is clarity, not intimidation. If you find yourself piling on derivative words just to sound sophisticated, you have lost the thread. A useful test is this. After you translate an everyday description into Holophase language, try translating it back into a simpler, everyday description. If the new everyday version is clearer, more insightful, or more accurate than the original, then the translation was worthwhile. If it is muddier and more confusing, you may need to simplify. The goal is always to see more truly, not just to speak more technically. Translation can also run in the opposite direction, from holophase to everyday. Sometimes you will encounter an equation or model that feels abstract and distant. Perhaps you see a set of coupled differential equations describing predator-prey dynamics, or a dispersion relation linking omega and k in a strange material, or a phase diagram with lines separating different regimes of behavior. In holophase terms, you can read these as statements about how derivatives are linked and how patterns shift as parameters change. The translation task is then to find everyday images that make those structures intuitive. A dispersion relation might become a story about how different musical notes travel through a medium, with some outrunning others. A phase diagram might become a map of a landscape where valleys represent stable states and saddles represent thresholds of transformation. When you develop skill in this direction, you become a better teacher and communicator. You are able to explain deep structures to people who have never seen an equation by choosing images that mirror the holophase grammar. You might explain feedback by talking about a microphone near a speaker. You might explain nonlinearity by talking about how gently pushing a child on a swing is different from pushing hard enough to throw them off. You might explain stability by talking about a marble in a bowl versus a marble balanced on top of a hill. All of these metaphors are small translations from derivative structure into lived experience. The holophase framework makes this process more systematic, giving you confidence that your metaphors are not just decorative, but directly connected to the underlying grammar of change. There is a subtle spiritual benefit to this translational way of seeing. When you habitually translate the world into a single, unified language of change and relation, you are constantly reminded that everything is connected. The same grammar that shapes the orbit of planets shapes the firing of neurons and the flow of rivers. The same patterns of stability and instability that govern stars also govern societies and personal habits. This does not trivialize the uniqueness of any one thing. Instead, it gives you a sense of belonging in a coherent cosmos. You are not standing outside reality as a detached observer. You are part of the same phi field you are studying. Another sentence in the universal story. Practically, you can turn translation into a daily exercise. Choose one example each day and deliberately walk it through both languages. One day you might pick boiling water. Another day, a crowded bus stop. Another day, a memory from childhood. Another day, a political headline. For each one, write or think a short everyday description. Then patiently unpack its holophase translation. Ask about the timescales at play, from the very fast to the very slow. Notice the spatial gradients, from the very small to the very large. Trace the motion, from subtle internal shifts to obvious external flows. Look for topological structures, such as loops, branches, clusters, and boundaries. Finally, identify the balances and imbalances that give the situation its particular flavor. At first, this will feel like work. With practice, it will become natural, almost like hearing a second melody beneath the first. As your skill deepens, you may find that certain domains call to you more strongly. Perhaps you are drawn to biology, or to climate, or to urban design, or to personal psychology. The holophase language does not force you to be a generalist. Instead, it gives you a common foundation that you can specialize from. You can become, for example, someone who translates the behavior of ecosystems into holophase descriptions and back, helping farmers, conservationists, and policymakers see the hidden structures that sustain or undermine resilience. Or you can become someone who translates the dynamics of digital networks into this language, helping engineers and users understand why certain architectures are fragile and others robust. In each case, you become a bridge between the local details of a field and the universal grammar of phi. Finally, translation is also an act of humility. It reminds you that any one description, whether everyday or holophase, is only a projection, a shadow of a deeper, richer reality. The holophase field itself is more than any formula or metaphor we can write. By moving back and forth between ways of speaking, you avoid the trap of believing that any one story is the whole truth. Instead, you cultivate a flexible, multi-layered understanding in which different descriptions support and check one another. In that flexibility, there is wisdom. And in that wisdom, there is space for both science and meaning, both structure and wonder. In that spirit, translation becomes a daily act of quiet devotion. In the next part, we will take one more step. We will not just read and translate, we will begin to write. We will construct our first complete holophase sentences together, starting from simple everyday situations and building their full triune descriptions. For now, it is enough that you know this. You already carry two powerful languages inside you, and with practice, you can move between them with ease. The holophase language does not replace your humanity. It gives you a new way to understand it. Salam, and peace be upon you.